This is the PowerPoint for our light and shadow assignment in Art 205. To begin with here, we're kind of talking about light, and as it says on the slide, it is the source which creates continuous tonal images in the camera and makes the world visible. So we're talking about how that light turns into tone and contrast. So even though we look at the world in color, we want to think about kind of through a black and white lens so that we can really see the differences in how light renders subjects. So I always like to kind of show this slide by a photographer named Hiroshi Sugimoto. And part of this body work, he would go to the movie theaters, these kind of really ornate movie theaters, old theaters, and he would start his camera exposure when the movie started, just open up the shutter, and while he was watching the movie, it would record, and at the end of the movie, he would turn off the shutter. So the shutter speed is about the length of a movie, so hour and a half or so. And you can see here that during that whole hour and a half, some areas got blown out white, like the screen, because that's a giant reflector where light's hitting. And some areas never got any light at all in kind of the lower left right parts of the seats and the upper right and left parts of the ceiling. No light ever got there, thus nothing was ever recorded. And then you have some areas that are in between. So you can really see sort of that light has to hit something in order to have it record information. So a big part of this is thinking about direct light versus diffuse light. So direct light, you can think of the sun, and diffuse light, you can think of clouds in front of the sun. There's a lot of different ways to think of this. Direct light, you can think of a bare light bulb. Diffuse, you can think about putting a white pillowcase in front of that light bulb, or putting a softbox around a strobe. All sorts of ways to diffuse that light. It basically interrupts the light before it hits the subject. So here's just kind of an example how that goes into highlight and shadow. So on the top, a spotlight, you get the specular light, which has a crisp light. It's going to have one kind of really strong highlight, and then it's going to turn to dark fairly quick. It will not fade out slow. It'll change quickly, and then the shadow has a crisp edge. Whereas diffuse light on the bottom, you're going to see kind of a gradation from the highlight to the shadow side. It's going to be more of a transition. And then if you look at the shadow itself, the shadow have more of a soft edge. So here's kind of a 3D object and not a drawing version of that. And you can kind of see a lot of things, but the specular or the reflective part there, you can see the tiny little highlight, sort of like what shows up in eyeballs. And then you can kind of see where the highlight's hitting, where the shadow is. The light source is on one side, it casts a shadow to the other. All these different parts of the light. So that hits light hits objects in different ways. So very similar paper quality here, direct light in the top left versus diffuse light in the bottom right. And you can see it renders the subject very differently. So outdoors, direct light on the left, lots of big contrast between light and shadow. Diffuse light, not so much on the right. So these are just some things to kind of consider depending on what time of day you are shooting and how the natural light, especially from the sun, is going to affect objects on that time of day. So when shooting in early morning fog, or you could think of kind of that marine layer if you're close to the coast, you're going to have things that have more of this sort of hazy look. If it's out in the desert in high noon, you're going to have this really strong, really bright, strong highlights, really crisp, contrasty shadows. So long shadows occur late or early in the day when the sun is lower to the horizon line. So you can see here on this person that if you have a kind of midday light coming down on the forehead, it casts a shadow into the eyes, and maybe it's not the most flattering light. Whereas if we move that subject into the shade, you can see it's more even and you don't get those shadows over the eye sockets. So when we look at objects and kind of look at this in detail, on the top left you have less contrast, on the top right you have more contrast. So you get kind of more definition in the texture of that peeling paint. You can see that both in color and in black and white. So these are just different ways that we can think of this. So the lit side is positive space in a figure or a photograph. So kind of where the light is hitting, that kind of tends to merge towards us, and where the the shadows that tends to recede from us. So that's that positive space versus negative space. So the shadow side of the light is negative space and harbors ground against figure and delineates the geometry of the photograph canvas and the camera frame. So you can kind of see that it almost creates a frame to have shadows around an edge. This is kind of an extreme of what the contrast does in an image like this. So you can kind of see this half lit, half dark sort of light shadow when you have a light source that's coming from one main direction. So you can kind of flip these ideas. This early picture from 1969 of Bill Cosby, and you can kind of see how he's essentially backlit as there's very little detail, and he's shadowed as a result with the light being on the wall behind him. So shadows can create compositional elements. We talked about line and diagonal lines from shadows, converging lines, leading lines. So here are some situations we're going to deal with in our assignment. So half lit, half dark. This is kind of an extreme situation, but if you have side lighting, the nose, the forehead, and the chin create a natural ridge that can block the light to the other side. Here's that same sort of idea with some window light. Here you can see the bleachers and the repetition in the architecture by having the light hit one side, creating a shadow on the other side. More window light, creating sort of this lit area by the window and shadow on the opposite. More examples. So this is kind of fun. These are actual sculptures, but to complete the sculpture you need a light source so that you get a shadow. So they look flat till the light hits them, and then you can kind of see that the shadow creates kind of on the right faces, and on the left it turns an exclamation mark into a question mark. So another scenario we're going to deal with is merging out of darkness. So when really kind of the frame of the image is fairly dark and the subject kind of emerges out of sort of the center of the frame or somewhere in the center, that's where you have kind of this emerging out of darkness area. So there's a lot of darkness in the image. Pinhole photography kind of naturally does this with the vignetting that happens. So another situation we're looking at is patterns created by shadow. So whether it's blinds that are casting shadows, fabric that's casting shadows, chain link fence that's casting shadows, anything where the light comes through and it hits an object and creates the shadows into a pattern. Here's a fun one with the chain link fence. It's kind of diffused over their bodies. So we're also going to talk about using silhouettes or backlit on purpose. We've talked about how to correct this exposure-wise, but we're also going to talk about using it on purpose. So sometimes it can be really fun to play with backlit photographs or silhouettes. You get kind of those abstract shapes almost. Guess what that is? Look at it and see if you can figure it out. It's pretty cool once you figure it out. So here, two boys playing with a jar of fireflies. It's kind of distorted and abstracted because of the shallow depth of field, but also you can kind of see that they're backlit. More of those sculptures I was talking about earlier. So here's some student work. Here you can see it's great examples of composition, diagonal lines, really harsh contrasty light. Whereas here's mostly darkness and then a little bit of sliver of light hitting the face and the shoulder. Here the shadow of the bike is the subject as opposed to the bike itself. You can see patterns created by shadow falling on this person's face. Here's different ways silhouettes and backlit. The tombstones are kind of backlit. You see the light source in the background there. Other examples. So I'm going to switch over and out of the PowerPoint. We're going to go to the assignment itself. So as we look here, what we're doing is we're only shooting with available light. So this has to be done with available light, no flash. Available light can be sun, it can be moon, it can be a lamp that's in the room, it can be, headlights of a car, things like that, but it has to be available. It cannot be a burst of light like a flash. So those are the big things when thinking about this. And then when we go through this, as you're shooting, make sure you're shooting camera raw, manual shooting mode. You're going to avoid motion blur, so that means you're going to really stick to shutter speeds of 1/60th or faster. Use tripod or equivalent at slower shutter speeds. I want you to do a white balance test shot for each new lighting location. That can be with your gray card or a white balance device. Meter off the gray card when possible. You'll have more accurate exposures. Shoot a minimum of 5 unique scenes. So what I mean by that is like 5 different locations or 5 different times a day. Just kind of make sure they all look like a variety on the contact sheet, not just one place at one time. Bracket your exposure, so you'll do normal exposure according to light meter, 1 stop overexposed, and 1 stop underexposed. Shoot a minimum of 24 exposures, including brackets and white balance shots. So on the contact sheet, I'm kind of looking for those things we just talked about, 24 to 48 exposures. So if you shoot more, you can narrow it down to the best of. You'll take 2 best images through Lightroom. When you do this, you're going to edit both of those as a color and a black and white. So you'll have best image 1 color, best image 1 black and white, best image 2 color, best image 2 black and white. So you're turning in those edits to me. Now, I'll explain a lot of this in class, but when you drop this in the Dropbox, there'll be one folder with everything in it: your contact sheet file, your original file, so you have 2 raw files, unedited, and you'll have 4 edit files. 2 of those will be color, 2 of those will be black and white, and then I'm going to have you turn in with this, I'll have you turn in your Lightroom catalog. So the rest we'll talk about here in class. That gives you kind of an example of what to expect on the assignment itself.